The Duchess, by xxImpressions. Chapter 3. Your slow pacing back and forth continued as you considered the formal invitation in your hand. The elegant cardstock had been sitting relatively untouched since you first opened it a few days ago, but given that the engagement you were invited to was being hosted tonight, you felt it was finally time to make up your mind about going. While there were no real obstacles that could prevent you from accepting the invitation, the memories of your last social outing were making you weary about seeking out another. On one hand, these were strangers, people you barely knew and owed nothing toward. But at the same time, you could not ignore that the Duchess of Hastings' offer for friendship seemed sincere and was something you would not mind pursuing given how isolated your life had been thus far. Since you were raised in the country by an elderly aunt that wanted nothing to do with you, your chances for social interactions had been limited for the better part of your existence. Given your sudden marriage barely a month into your societal debut, and the year-long seclusion you had to endure after your husband's unexpected death, it was not difficult to recognize a part of you longed for some kind of human interaction. Actually, it would be more accurate to say a huge part of you longed to feel a sense of connection to someone rather than feel like a mere participant in everyone else's story. Staring at the card once more, you also recognized that if you wanted that connection, you were at least going to have to make the effort to seek it out. That said, you ultimately decided to send your acceptance of the invitation, although your nerves were alight as you did so. Those same nerves stayed with you even after you had arrived at Hastings' house and were formally announced to the other guests already gathered, though you made sure not to show it as you confidently entered the drawing room. While you suppose you should have expected it, you were still surprised when a noticeable hush replaced the once light conversation abound within the room. Given your lack of opportunities to participate in the ton's gossip, you have never been quite sure how much power a rumor might have over society as a whole. But based on the stares you were pointedly ignoring as you made your way to greet your hosts, it was clear that it was more than you originally thought. In acknowledging the reaction your arrival had caused, you also had to acknowledge that this was a situation somewhat of your own making. You came to this conclusion since one of your lady's maids recently brought to your attention that a certain Lady Whistledown had written yet another sheet featuring your name. Rather than discuss your mysterious return as a Dowager Duchess once more, the author had chosen to write about your recent promenade through the park with a highly sought-after Viscount this time, reporting on the details as if they suggested some kind of hidden connection between the two of you. Lady Whistledown was not shy in publicly announcing her support of such a match. While you were glad to have her approval, as opposed to her abhorrence, you were now realizing it still came with the cost of being the center of attention. No good deed goes unpunished, you thought with a touch of humor wryness. Completely aware of the amount of curious eyes that followed your unhurried steps, you made sure to give a courteous nod in greeting once you were stood in front of the two familiar faces and gracefully said, "Duke, Duchess, thank you for extending the invitation to dine in your wonderful home tonight. I am delighted to be here." The couple bowed their heads as well and each gave a kind smile before the Duchess, being addressed, assuredly replied with, "It is our pleasure. Taking into account the impression my spirited sister must have made upon our first meeting, we are only too happy you decided to accept." You all shared a brief laugh as you recalled how excited the girl had been, which was enough to break the formal atmosphere that currently surrounded your group. Being honest, you said in an amused tone, "Your sister seems like a charming young lady who certainly made a great first impression. I feel so lucky to have had the privilege of meeting her, though I do hope she is able to hold onto her ribbons a bit more in the future." This response encouraged another round of chuckles to be shared before the lady of the house caught eyes with her butler from across the room. After receiving a confirmatory nod from the man, she turned to the rest of the gathered attendees and cordially announced, "Everyone, we are going into the dining room." The chatter that had since picked up from the hushed tone it had taken upon your entrance quieted once again as people began to make their way into the elegant room. Having found your chair located near the head of the table, you were seated relatively quickly while others straggled to settle in. Since you were focused on reading the dinner menu posted on the card in front of your plate, you did not notice when the seat next to you suddenly became occupied. But you did notice when a voice said with obviously faux astonishment,
What a coincidence this is.
Completely caught off guard, you were even more unprepared to be met with a pair of kind, familiar eyes that had a mischievously triumphant twinkle sparkling within them when you snapped your head to the side. Stunned to see your handsome rescuer sat so close to you, your mind only had the capacity to say with a touch of breathlessness, "I do not understand your meaning, Lord Bridgerton." Taking in the sight of the well-kept Viscount, you watched as that little bit of triumph grew into a pleased smirk on his face as he answered with a certain coyness.
I merely meant to point out how fortuitous it is that we are seated next to each other for the duration of this meal.
Starting to catch on, your eyes began to narrow as you said with a raised brow, "Oh, so this is all a setup then?" But as if he expected such an inquiry, he was quick to reply with a casual,
No, this is just a conversation. And given how our last one ended, I simply wanted to ensure that we would not be interrupted.
As the feeling of being well and truly trapped sunk in, you frantically tried to think of any means of escape, and had to applaud this man's planning when none came to mind. Since it would not be socially acceptable to leave when the meal had not even begun yet, and because you were sat directly next to the head of the table at the corner, with a strategically placed candelabrum sitting in between you and the other guests across the way, it became crystal clear that you had little choice but to converse with the only person sitting next to you. And that just happened to be the Viscount. Though you did not fully appreciate being tricked, you could not deny the pleasantly warm sensation that suddenly went through you as you recognized the amount of effort he put in for you both to meet again. And while you were the one that chose to part ways, you can secretly admit to yourself that you were glad to be given another chance to interact with your handsome rescuer, even if it was happening on his terms. With the way your thoughts had been constantly flashing back to the few times you were in the Viscount's presence as of late, you decided one last conversation might be what you needed to bring you some peace of mind. So, after clearing your throat, you looked back at the man once you had your composure and openly said out of curiosity, "I assume the Duchess of Hastings played a part in this." Anthony took it as a good sign that you did not appear crossed with him for his deception, and was only too happy to truthfully reply,
Yes, but Daphne only agreed to help on the condition that I tell you her offer of friendship was a genuine one, and I know she is hoping you will take her up on it.
Appreciating the honesty and kindness being extended your way, you nodded and said, "I may very well choose to do so," before shooting a slightly bashful grin in his direction. The footmen, who were going around the table at this point, chose that moment to serve you both from their trays before moving on to the next guests. The silence following your first bites continued until you wiped your mouth with your napkin and finally asked after swallowing your food, "So, what do you want to know, Lord Bridgerton?" The Viscount in question took his time thinking about his answer before he opened his mouth and calmly said,
Well, first, I would like to know who that man is.
Knowing exactly who he was referring to, you exhaled a small sigh and allowed your gaze to fall to your dinner plate as you quietly replied, "He is the younger brother of my late husband." At the mention of your husband and his passing, you could see the Viscount about to apologize for your loss, as was the sympathetic thing to do, but before he could get it out, you stopped him with a tight smile and a raised hand. After, you explained with a learned formalness, "I did not know him, and so I do not feel his loss. Therefore, there is no need for you to apologize." Comprehending your story a bit more with that new piece of information, Anthony hid it well, but inside he could not help but to still feel sorry. He was sorry to hear you were apparently married off to a man you did not know. He was sorry to hear you were forced to mourn someone you obviously had no connection to. And he was sorry that this man's brother was now harassing you on top of it. Nodding to show his understanding as he mentally tucked away these particular details, Anthony contemplated you for a few moments before asking in a quiet voice of his own,
So then, why was your brother-in-law trying to attack you?
You took a few seconds to think about the best way of answering until you finally just sighed and truthfully said, "He wants to marry me." Not seeing how a marriage proposal could escalate to an assault, Anthony attempted to ask another question but was cut off when you said with a level of reassurance and seriousness, "There are too many ears here, so I will explain the rest at another time." Seeing the warranted doubt clear on his face, you earnestly finished with, "I promise." while gazing directly into his eyes. When he saw the imploring way you were looking at him to drop this subject, he decided to relent and understandingly said,
"As you wish, Your Grace."
Turning to focus his attention back on his meal, the Viscount could not ignore that his mind was whirling with questions and a new sense of determination. Catching glimpses of you from the corner of his eyes, he glanced your way for a second or two before thinking,
"No one is going to hurt her again."
Quickly directing his gaze back to his own plate, lest he be caught staring, Anthony decidedly made a promise of his own when he followed up this thought with,
"And though I do not know how, I do know I am going to make sure of it."
End of chapter 3.